All right, let's do some key pieces, key info about the formation of Earth, and so baby Earth, and the life in it, and the first life that comes out from it. Oops, sorry about that. And life on it. Okay, so here's an artist's rendition, artist drawing of what baby Earth, first newborn Earth, first looked like. The Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. That's what BIYA stands for. And it was formed when the solar system was formed. And so at first, you have to imagine it just like this artist did. It's this big ball of molten rock. Super hot. And we know this information because we know the way that a bunch of new planets form, new solar systems form. And so we're going to see that based on that information, we can imagine that baby Earth, I'm going to call it baby Earth, was bombarded by a whole bunch of meteors. It was super duper hot. There were crazy lightning storms, and there was very little or no atmosphere. But the little bit of atmosphere that we think it was composed of here, very, very, very little atmosphere. But we think it probably was made up of a lot of carbon dioxide gas, a lot of water gas, water vapor, as opposed to liquid because it's too hot for there to be water liquid. Definitely no oxygen in the air, so nothing that you and I could breathe. That hadn't formed yet, and I'll tell you why this is important. Definitely no nitrogen. Remember when we talked about the nitrogen cycle? We said that there's pretty much everything you're breathing, inhaling in is nitrogen. 78% of the air is nitrogen, but you breathe it right back out. You can't do anything with it. And so at least our skies were not blue. Sky not blue. Because the nitrogen in the atmosphere is, for the most part, the most responsible for this blue of the blue skies, right? So there's lots of hot stuff going on. Notice this shows that we're bombarded by meteors. There's a lot of chaos and it's hot. But slowly, very slow, it takes a while. Slowly this will start to cool. This cools. Takes a while, of course, as it would for any planet. Eventually, your crust will start to cool. Maybe you start to have some water as liquid, as opposed to water as just hot gas. Maybe you're also bombarded by some nice, lovely, comets or icy things. Let's do some icy stuff. That's going to bring some water. Liquid water into the planet. There's a bunch of different reasons why we think. Just imagine brand new baby Earth. No life could form here. It's way too hot. And there's no liquid water for it to form here yet. But we know eventually that life does form. I mean, life is here, so it formed at some point. We don't know exactly how it happened. We don't absolutely know, we weren't there, but science is okay with not absolutely knowing for sure. But we have some hypotheses based on a little bit of evidence that I'll tell you today. We know what happened in the water, primarily because we only see fossils from water organisms for a long, long time, but I'll tell you a little bit more about why that is. So life happens, right? So one of the first hypotheses we think about how life happened, we see this evidence of our phospholipid bilayers. Let me use orange for this, phospholipid bilayers. Remember, phospholipid bilayers are those membranes that are the barrier of our cells themselves. But the bilayer itself, phospholipid bilayers, form spontaneously in the water. If you grab just like a jar of lipids, phospholipids especially, and you dump them into water, they form these little spontaneous little layers that we actually, if there's nothing inside of it, we actually call them microspheres or lipospheres. When we're looking at Unit 2, phospholipid bilayer means that you've got, pretend that this is super microscopic, I guess, right? And instead of having just a few layers, you have 2 layers of water-loving heads and 2 layers of the fatty acid tails. Right, we drew these before. So there's 2 layers of it. And inside you'll have a nucleus, and you have all your organelles, at least in our cells. But microspheres are when they form, but there's nothing inside. That says nothing inside. Inside. But that means that if these formed just spontaneously in the past, it could have trapped some of the biochemicals inside, and we'll see that in a second. Okay, so they form on their own. And then we see this Miller-Urey experiment, which we'll see in the next slide, that shows us that when we mix chemicals on early Earth, chemicals we find in early Earth, on baby Earth, we put some heat, we put some lightning to it, we can form some of our organic compounds. For life. Again, which could have gotten stuck inside of these membrane-like things. Structures. Okay? So at least I'll introduce you to those 2 things. We know how we can make organic compounds, and we know how the membranes form. Somehow, life finally shows up. Life shows up on Earth. Life on Earth. And so we have the earliest evidence, about 3.6 billion years ago, of the earliest fossils we've ever found. They're prokaryotes. And so life happened at least at this point. If there was life that happened before, we don't have the evidence for it, but it at least happened 3.6 billion years ago. And 3.4 billion years ago, we start to see cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria is going to be really important because they're photosynthetic. Photosynthetic bacteria. And you can see a lot of these in these structures called stromatolites. It's a really important, really old classical experiment where some scientists took a bunch of gases that we think were around on early Earth. We gave them an electric shock to pretend to be lightning, and we found that it can form the basic building blocks of life, right? So we added some gases from early Earth, or at least the ones that they thought were around for that time. They added a spark to simulate lightning because there was a lot of lightning there. You add some heat because it was super hot on baby Earth. And you do this in the lab, and you can collect a bunch of your organic compounds. So that means that in here, this little beaker, you collected amino acids. Remember, amino acids are gonna come together to make your proteins. You're gonna find your fatty acids. You're going to see lipids and hydrocarbons. All of these guys are going to make up your membranes and some of your nucleic acids too. It's going to make up your DNA and your RNA, right? And so this experiment is super duper old, and there's some problems with it. For example, not all of these gases, we've found more evidence that not all of these gases could have existed on Earth. Like, remember we said there couldn't be any nitrogen gas. There probably wasn't any methane gas. But we know there was carbon dioxide, hydrogen gas. So there are modern versions of it. And the modern versions still show that this is a spontaneous process in which really small basic elements can form these important biomolecules that are going to be important for our life. And those are the ones that could have been trapped inside the membrane-like structures, right? The microspheres. To be something that would already start to look like a cell. And there's other hypotheses about how these organic compounds might have formed, just because they're sort of interesting. You want to know. Some folks think that deep sea hydrothermal vents might have been where the first life was formed. Turns out they have all the conditions for early Earth. So they're super hot. There's no oxygen around for at least us, oxygen breathers. But there's loads of some of the other compounds that are necessary to make those building blocks of life. So there's methane gas. There's some of the other components that we wouldn't have seen just on the surface of the Earth. So ammonia, definitely lots of carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, the stuff that's still present in those hydrothermal vents. And organisms live there now. Living things are there. Maybe that's where everything came from. That's one of the hypotheses too. And some folks like to think that maybe these organic compounds came from meteors that hit the Earth. Meteorites are always crashing on the Earth, and so they bring with them all sorts of unusual organic compounds. We find unusual organic compounds in them all the time. So maybe they're the source for our original organic compounds. Although the problem with that is, well, how did those organic compounds come to be, right? Where did those come from? Nonetheless, at least it tells us, well, maybe we on Earth got them from meteorites. So let's look at those first organic compounds anyway. All right, so as are the compounds that we absolutely need. We know we need fatty acids, we need lipids. We need lipids for our membranes, for the cholesterol in our membranes, for other stuff, but at least for membranes is an important one. We need genetic material. We need something like DNA and RNA to transmit the information on how to make one cell or how to make the cell function, to transmit information from the parent cell to the daughter cell. And then we also need enzymes to do some work for us, to catalyze chemical reactions, to transport proteins from one side of the cell to another, and to make more copies of your cell, and to copy info. We're looking at our current, remember the central dogma of the modern world is that DNA makes RNA, is transcribed into RNA, is transcribed into a protein, and a protein is pretty much everything that you see about you, either makes everything that you are or is a component of everything that you are. Well, it turns out that even back when Watson and Crick had discovered DNA, they were looking at RNA, they said, well, RNA is a nucleic acid. So they thought instead of going from DNA to RNA to protein, well, RNA is a nucleic acid. Maybe we didn't need DNA to begin with. RNA is a nucleic acid. It can copy itself. Remember, RNA polymerase is what copies. RNA is really just a piece of information, is genetic material. Might just be a little piece of it, but it's still genetic material. It can copy itself. And a lot of RNA also functions as an enzyme. Works as an enzyme. So it can do stuff, right? Ribosomes put amino acids together. So maybe what happened was that the world really started off as RNA. RNA that can copy itself, RNA that can make proteins, RNA that can do some work around the cell. Maybe the world started off as sloppy, less protected, but simpler RNA. That's the RNA world hypothesis that life first began with RNA as the genetic material. Don't totally know how it happened. We have some ideas of it, and we can reproduce some of these ideas in the lab. But we finally come to when life finally shows up, about 3.6 billion years ago. The first life was prokaryotic. Prokaryotic means, remember, no nucleus, means they're smaller, means there's no organelles, means they're single-celled. So we can tell you that much about the first life. Among those first cells were anaerobic prokaryotes. So prokaryotes meaning there's no nucleus, they don't have organelles, they're smaller, quote-unquote simpler. There's a category of these prokaryotes called cyanobacteria. They're anaerobic, meaning they don't no need for oxygen, which is great because there's no oxygen around anyway, so they can't live with something that isn't around anyway. They're unicellular, as prokaryotes are, single-celled. But the interesting about them is that they're photosynthetic, meaning they can make their own food, they make their own glucose, thanks to at least beginning with the energy from the sunlight. Make their own glucose. But they also give off oxygen as a byproduct. Meaning they release oxygen, the gas, out into give off oxygen gas. Well, this is super duper duper. I'm going to put loads of stars for how important it is. They release oxygen into the atmosphere, and over time, the oxygen in the atmosphere increases. Over a long period of time, you start to get lots of oxygen in the air. Lots of it, okay? I'll tell you why that's important in a second. Here you have some pictures again of some stromatolites that show you a bunch of different prokaryotes. If you see this sort of blue looking layer on lakes or in the ocean, a lot of the times instead of algae, it's actually cyanobacteria because they're photosynthetic. Anything green, probably photosynthetic, right? All right, and from our first bits of life, we get our first groups of prokaryotes, which you were introduced to before, the archaebacteria and the eubacteria. The first eukaryotic cells show up approximately 1.5 billion years ago. Eukaryotic cells means they're bigger, right? They have a nucleus, they have more stuff inside, they have organelles inside. And remember that in science, a theory really means that it's an explanation backed by loads of evidence. I think that the first eukaryotes formed when a larger cell it engulfed, it took in, basically like it ate a smaller, but it didn't digest it. It didn't kill it, digest it, eat it up, use it for energy. Probably some mutation didn't let that happen. So it doesn't kill it, and it keeps it. And it keeps it in future generations. So its future generation cells also keep it. And it keeps it because something about it is really beneficial. It provides it with some sort of adaptation so that they form a symbiotic relationship. So one cell helps the other cell helps the other in return. Lots of generations pass, lots of mutations happen in both of them, but especially in the one that's the smaller internal little cell. They eventually lose some cell function, again, thanks to mutations. I'm going to write thanks mutations. And they remain behind, the remnants, as our modern day mitochondria and chloroplasts. Okay, so you can see this in this picture down here. You can see that a larger cell engulfed some smaller cell, but didn't kill it. For whatever reason, it couldn't. Some mutation didn't let it. It turns out that this small aerobic pre-mitochondria was really good at making ATP, at ATP making. Well, that's a pretty handy adaptation for this big cell to hold on to, right? And at the same time, the big cell gives a little home to the smaller cell. Let's look at the chloroplasts, because we think they come second. So some other groups of these cells, they engulf some photosynthetic prokaryotes. The photosynthetic prokaryote, well, it makes its own glucose just by using the sun, energy from the sunlight. That's a pretty handy adaptation to keep on to. So this future generations keep it, keeps mutating, loses some of its cell functions, and sticks around as a chloroplast for plants. I totally oversimplified that for you guys, but at least you get this, hopefully you can get the story. Some of the evidence for this, well, mitochondria, I'm gonna write mito, and chloroplasts, darn, no I didn't. Mitochondria and chloroplasts are about the same size as the prokaryotes, as bacteria. Let's just say as bacteria. Mitochondria and chloroplasts, they have their own DNA. And it's a circular DNA, the way that bacteria have their DNA. What? I'm starting to get a little more complex here, right? Mitochondria and chloroplasts, they don't care about mitosis. They reproduce completely on their own, independently of the rest of the cell. So they reproduce on their own. And it looks a lot like binary fission, like the sort of reproduction you see in bacteria. And they even make their own proteins. They might have their own DNA. I'm sorry, no, they already have their own DNA. They might have their own ribosomes. And just to make fun of our cells, their DNA, the DNA and the ribosomes of your mitochondria, if you look at the sequences of them, they are more related to bacteria, more similar to bacteria DNA than to the DNA that is in the nucleus of the cells that they're in, than the nucleus. So their DNA is more of a cousin of regular bacteria than the DNA in your own nucleus. Furthermore, we do see symbiosis happening. Right here you've got some salamander with little algae inside of them. Salamander is an animal. And inside of their animal cells, they have some photosynthetic algae. sea slug is one of my favorite ones. It's its upper layer of cells has a bunch of algae in it. The algae is photosynthetic. But the sea slug is an animal. So these are two completely different types of cells. So it turns out this sea slug, it can just lie out in the sunshine and let the algae make the glucose. And so the animal doesn't have to eat, or it doesn't have to eat as much. But the algae gets a little home in a nice protective animal cell. To break down the history of life on Earth into these particular eras and further subdivisions, but we're oversimplifying because we can in our class. So this is more like the beginning of time, older time. Up here we've got modern times. We are currently in what we call the Cenozoic era, where animals rule. And each era is broken by different mass extinction events. That means lots of organisms died between each of these eras. So each era begins and ends with a mass extinction, lots of massive death. But with each mass extinction, lots of death, you have the chance for new life to show up. So precambrian era is the oldest era, where we have smaller animals. The Paleozoic is next. Mesozoic, this is where you've got the dinosaurs. And finally, our current era is the Cenozoic era, where we've got all of our mammals. A little bit of a note on the Precambrian era, so the beginning of time. It's almost about 90% of the Earth's history was stuck in this Precambrian time. Uh-oh, I got some sort of pop-up here. So those first 4 billion years of life was ruled by, let's just fall over here, mostly prokaryotes. Small, what we call simpler, less stuff to them, living organisms. And that's right here when the Earth forms, up until